welcome back and take it away, Callie. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. Again, my name is Callie Paredes. I will be presenting on mental health needs of folks with substance and behavioral health addictions. And so, without further ado, about me a little bit before we get into the material. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a consultant. I work in the education realm as well. I am the co-founder of Kalmara Consulting Collective. And I've worked in the field for over 10 years, so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I was also the behavioral health director for a 60-bed substance use residential treatment program. So I hope that you have questions, and I would be more than happy to take the time at the end of this to answer them. Before we get into it, I would love to do a little bit of grounding breath work. We all have busy schedules and busy lives, so if you want to join me, participation is always your choice, but if you want to settle, put your feet on the floor. If you're sitting at a desk or a table, notice where you're sort of feeling comfortable. We're going to inhale for 4 seconds. We're going to pause just for a moment and then exhale for 6 seconds. So I like to close my eyes and pretend I'm on a beach somewhere really nice and relaxing, but we can inhale for 4. So 4, just pause for a moment and then exhale for a 6 count. So it's nice. Nice and grounding. Can do it a few more times, repeat 3, 4 times, sort of shift your shoulders. I do this throughout the day, so I usually just do it once and I feel a little bit better. And then when you come back, just notice what you can see, what you see around you, what you can feel, what you can hear. It's just a nice midday break, which is great. So why does this topic matter? Because lots of reasons, and it's the reason that it's near and dear is because it overlaps so much with everything that we see in the therapy field, and I think everything that we see as people in general. So there's an overlap of substance and behavioral addiction with mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, chronic stress. We see a lot of things in our day and age, so especially current times. So mental health needs to really be a focus when we're working on recovery outcomes from any addiction. And addiction often functions as an adaptive survival response. So it's really a coping mechanism for the mental health stressors, right? Which we will get into. And then addressing addiction without mental health is not necessarily full holistic care because they are so intertwined and related. So what is addiction? The definition is technically a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive substance or behavior seeking with continued use despite the harmful consequences and comes with very long-lasting changes in the brain. So really, it moves from hobby, habit, whether it's good or not, right, into an addiction when it becomes sort of this compulsive force in your life. Different types of addiction: food addiction, substance addiction, whether it's medication prescribed or otherwise, recreational substances, and then behavioral addictions like gambling, or we could probably get into a lot of different things, and that might be its own workshop in and of itself. But the addiction cycle, so when we talk about substance or behavior addictions, there's typically the same cycle. And the reason that this is important is because it does tie into our mental health and the mental health needs and the treatment needs of what's going on. So the stages of addiction include the initial use, often triggered by curiosity or stress, or you just want an out, right? You want to have some fun, whether it's gambling or a substance, food. And then there's escalation. So you increase your use over time, starts to feel better and better and better, and then you need to use more, right? And that's where dependence comes in. So the initial maybe exploration of whatever the substance or behavior is no longer does the trick, and you need to increase it. Your brain begins to exhibit withdrawal symptoms when you do not do the behavior or have the substance. And then that's where relapse typically stop or you try to slow down. Relapse shows up and it just triggers stress, which makes you want to have relief, which triggers use, which triggers guilt and all of that. So over on the right, you can see there's usually an emotional trigger, leads to craving, leads to the ritual of whatever the addiction is. So for some folks, it's finding a substance. For other folks, it's going to a casino and so on, right? Then using whatever the stress reliever is, and then guilt, which then again triggers the emotional cycle all over again. So, when we talk about substance and behavioral addictions, there are some more nuanced things worth noting. So, I included them here. So, addiction, again, is not just one thing or the other, it can be substances and behaviors. So, gambling, gaming, food, sex, being addicted to being on your phone, checking your phone, social media, all of those count. Um, Addictions usually activate or always activate actually the same pathways in the brain. So a win is a win, and that's how the brain sees it. And it functions sort of counterintuitively as a nervous system regulation. So it temporarily reduces stress, which is why it's so appealing, right? So in the moment, you typically feel better, but it's obviously not so helpful long term. And it's really often misunderstood. So behavioral addictions are often seen as bad habits, when really they can create the same guilt and shame cycle as something like a substance. And all of that requires the same compassion and clinical attention in treatment or recovery, even in the community. If you know someone and you're trying to help them, it's still a struggle and it counts as a mental health issue as well. So going into more of the nervous system, my background is also in neuropsychopharmacology, so I like to see how the brain functions when we talk about this type of stuff. So chronic stress really reshapes the brain and the nervous system. So this is where the mental health piece really is influencing the brain in addition to substance or behavioral addiction. So ongoing stress, trauma, instability, all of that keeps us in this really alert state, and we can't sort of come back down to base and feel safe. And so that's when our survival responses typically take over. So fight, flight, freeze, collapse. We don't often think of it in terms of our day-to-day, luckily, hopefully, right? But all of that turns into this need that we create within ourselves for relief, right? So if our nervous system is heightened, we're looking for relief. And again, the addictive behaviors can temporarily regulate our distress. So we feel a little better, we can numb out the pain. Short-term relief, again, long-term cost. So it's absolutely important to address as whatever you can as quickly as you can. And then understanding the cycle and how it affects your nervous system can really improve care. So seeing addiction in general as more of a cycle that can be broken within the neural connections we have can often help see it as more of something that is treatable instead of just a bad behavior, right? So when we talk about the adaptive response, a lot of folks, at least in my work, I have seen, and typically we know that substance or behavioral addiction is a short-term, temporary, right, fix, if you will, but it really becomes this sort of adapted response to just surviving in this fight or flight mode. So again, many addictive behaviors, especially, begin as coping strategies. So, again, with the chronic stress, trauma, loss, unmet emotional needs, which is not often spoken about. So, when we talk about the mental health needs of those with addiction, it's so important to see what is the need that is being filled, right? What's the void that's being filled? Because that's typically the root of what can help sort of moving forward and sustain that successful recovery. And again, addictive behaviors can help with stress. It serves a function. So seeing it as a function that can be replaced, or a behavior that can be replaced. What is a healthier way to feel this relief instead of turning to the addictive substance or behavior, right? And then it's also a sign that your nervous system is seeking some safety. So part of addiction recovery is including things that assist the folks in feeling safe, whether it's big emotions or physical safety or trying to remedy basic needs. All of that is super important and is seen in the mental health field. And remembering that adaptive does not mean ideal, but it's certainly understandable is a huge piece as well. And for folks who do struggle with addiction, the mental health component of shame and guilt is so big that that often is the biggest trigger for continued use, right? For relapse. So the responses are not moral failures, and that's sort of the general idea in treatment is it's not a failure of who you are. It's just sort of your cycle that we can really work on and address and create some safety for you. So mental health symptoms that come from addiction and that sort of feed addiction behaviors and patterns include anxiety, so heightened threat detection. I'm sure we've all felt anxious at some point about something, and it can be temporary. Maybe it's a situational anxiety. You feel nervous about something, maybe a job interview, something like that, first day of school, or it can become this heightened sort of state that we live in. So it reflects the nervous system's response to potential danger. And again, a lot of folks with behavioral or substance addictions often have this perceived sense of danger that they just cannot shake, and that's what they are numbing to. With that, depression, very common. It's energy conservation after prolonged stress. So in a nutshell, it's that you just shut down because you're so tired of maintaining this sort of fight or flight state for so long. So our bodies, our minds, our emotional capacity shuts down. Technically, our brain's trying to conserve energy. But then if you need more energy, what is the best ways? Typically by feeding the dopamine, which is the reward neurotransmitter. So, using the substance, going and doing the behavior that makes you feel better is often the response. And then trauma responses, right? So protection from perceived danger, again, it ties in with anxiety, but really having this trauma-based fear around, we have symptoms like hypervigilance, avoidance, dissociation. You just cannot get to a place of emotional or physical safety despite maybe being in a physically safe space. So that absolutely impacts all of the patterned use and the guilt and shame cycle. And the symptoms are meaningful signals when we talk about treatment. So when folks come into treatment, at least when I've seen them across the years, they're coming in and we don't see, their mental health struggles or their use patterns as flaws necessarily. We see it as indicators as to where they are struggling. And so, what are the needs that they have? Which is really that context-based understanding. So, who are you? What feels scary? What are you running from? What do you need? And how can we better support you, right? To make that shift from unhealthy patterns and substances to much more healthy coping skills. And the role of shame and stigma. So I felt like this is very relevant and worth mentioning because again, this seems to be the root of relapse. So shame intensifies the mental health symptoms. Typically, if you feel shame, you have heightened anxiety, heightened depressive symptoms, emotion dysregulation. Something is wrong with me. I can't get better. And then stigma on the outside just increases isolation. So if you are someone who's struggling, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to go to someone for help because it's stigmatized and you might be labeled as something negative, right? And you might not get the help that you need. And then shame fuels the addiction cycle from, a few slides ago. It just goes in to feeling bad or broken. You feel stressed out. You're looking for release, leads to relapse. But where relief can come in is when we take a trauma-informed approach, we can begin to reduce the harm for folks struggling with these substance or behavioral addictions. So trauma-informed looks like understanding. It looks like wanting to know additional context. It looks like understanding the person in a bigger picture instead of just what they are doing that feels wrong, right? And again, compassion supports healing. So I think this is fair for everyone. Think of, a time when you were struggling with something, the most helpful thing you probably received, hopefully, or could receive would be compassion and understanding, which is the goal. So before we can change any patterns in the sort of addiction world, we have to be able to regulate the nervous system. So again, in a nutshell, if you don't feel safe or calm, you can't make neurological changes, right? And pattern changes. So the nervous system has to feel safe before insight is possible. We can't learn if we don't feel safe. And then dysregulation limits learning and behavior change. So say, for example, you want to change, but you still are in a very emotionally dysregulated place and you're having a hard time with making decisions or processing information. Obviously, it will be difficult to try new behaviors or have them be successful because you are just not quite in a place to have the capacity for it. And then regulation supports just all of that higher order thinking, all of those decision makings. Our frontal cortex is all for judgment, right? And inhibitions and making good choices. So stabilizing that increases engagement and then retention for treatment programs or for changes made. And then pretty simply straightforward, change is more sustainable when it follows regulation. So we typically look to build safety, then we try to build change. So self-care is a huge piece of all of this. I feel like self-care is a pretty popular term, but with clinical support in the world of addiction, self-care really matters. So self-care supports the nervous system regulation. If you're able to take care of yourself and calm yourself down, you can think a little more clearly. Basics matter more than we realize. So sleep, hydration. If you have water in front of you, drink some water, right? Rest are really foundational to being able to have the capacity to make changes for yourself. Small, consistent practices are most effective, so no big changes, just one step at a time. And self-care is really stabilization. A lot of folks see it as indulgent or, something that's a luxury, when really it's absolutely necessary for wellness and for success with when you're trying to change addictive behaviors and patterns. And then regulation through self-care supports your recovery. If you're able to regulate yourself and sort of recognize where you're at and what you need, you can get the support you need before it, goes sideways or before relapse potentially occurs. And a brief self-care practice. Um, Again, you can do this in real time or not, but it can be very helpful. So if you're feeling a big feeling, you feel emotionally dysregulated, you can name the emotion. So maybe it's I feel anxious or I'm feeling really down about something or I'm upset. Then you can notice where it shows up in your body. So often folks with anxiety might feel tightness in their chest, they might feel sweaty. Depressive symptoms, your body might feel very heavy. There's no real right way, there's no, true indicators. It's just what you recognize for yourself. And then normalize the experience to some extent, right? So this makes sense given what I've lived through, or this makes sense for this situation right now. And go from there. And then give yourself some grace. Take a deep breath, say, hey, I'm trying my best. And the more you practice, right, practice makes closest to perfect as we can get, but it's just a good exercise to sort of walk through all of the emotion and the step to be able to better regulate yourself in these moments. And the community is such a huge piece of recovery. So despite talking about the nervous system and the individuality of, all of these processes, healing does not happen in isolation. So if you're struggling, typically isolation makes it worse. And so we're wired for connection and we want to belong and we want to have that connection. And that connection really buffers that stress and those relapse risks, which is great. But it's not great if you don't have safe relationships. So that's also part of recovery and paying attention to the mental health needs. Who's safe for you in your life so that you can feel safe enough to regulate yourself. And community care is not necessarily about fixing or monitoring. It's more about offering support and holding space for, right, someone who is struggling. Judgment does not help. Trying to fix, quote unquote, a person doesn't necessarily help, right? But being empathetic and compassionate, offering resources, and really just sitting with folks who might be struggling has often been the most effective thing. And connection creates space for growth. So if you feel connected and you feel safe, absolutely, success rates increase and skyrocket, and you are in a really good place. So trauma-informed care. So again, just reiterating, non-judgmental language. So don't, say it's your fault or lay blame. Safety over compliance. So do you feel safe? How can I support you? Choice and autonomy is huge. What would you like to do? What are your goals in getting better or stopping these patterns? Create consistency and predictability. So, what is this going to look like moving forward? How can I help you reliably so that you can trust that this will be helpful to you? Collaboration over authority. So, working with people instead of on them or for them is really most helpful. And then strengths-based support, right? What are you already good at? What are their strengths? What can you do for yourself? What do you do for others? And how can we really strengthen that so that you feel competent enough to change these behaviors for yourself? Tons of barriers, just quickly, stigma and fear of judgment, fragmented systems of care. So often there's a lack of continuity in the care system in, maybe it's a county or a city or oftentimes in different communities, there may not be resources that are talking to each other, and that can create some gaps. So it's hard to have consistent care throughout your recovery journey. Cultural, linguistic, and access barriers are huge. Definitely different demographics, different geographical areas, all of that can be hugely difficult for folks. And so it's very important to be mindful and culturally aware of the client's needs or the person's needs in your life. And a lot of people don't have good experience with care, right? So if you're looking for mental health care or addiction care, maybe they've been stigmatized in the past, or maybe they've been told it's just their fault, right? So it's not always a pleasant experience. And then structural and systemic inequities are always present, unfortunately. So poverty, housing instability, discrimination, all coupled with the limiting access, right, to quality mental health and behavioral health care, is a huge barrier. Supporting mental health and recovery, so integrated mental health and addiction care. So when we do it together, it's comorbid or codependent, very helpful. The trauma-informed and strength-based approach is good. And then peer and community support, so you're really continuing to support the person. Regulation-focused intervention, so how can you feel safe again? And then consistency and continuity of care, so just having predictable support really strengthens the trust. Excuse me. Key takeaways: mental health and addiction has to be addressed together for it to really be successful long term. Symptoms often reflect an adaptive survival response, so they can be huge indicators into what are the unmet needs of the person. Regulation comes before behavioral change, whether it's a substance or a behavioral addiction. Self-care is a clinical support, not a luxury. And connection is a hugely powerful protective factor in that mental health and addiction piece. Reflective question. I always like to think about this, and I ask folks this when I'm teaching or when I'm treating. What's one way you can approach addiction and mental health with more compassion and curiosity? So it's rhetorical question, but definitely food for thought. Here's a few resources, different websites that you can check out for help, your community contacts, the mental health and recovery services in your county, suicide and crisis line, and I have my contact info up there if you have any following questions or are looking for additional resources.
Callie, I have a question.
Yeah.
I received one question. How can we help someone who does not admit that they're addicted to, let's say, alcohol?
It's a hugely common question, right? And it's a common issue, unfortunately. Often showing support in and maybe not addressing it directly, which sounds very counterintuitive, but just letting folks know that you're there, giving folks resources, suggestions, connecting them with maybe people in your community who can, maybe mentor or nudge in the right direction, but creating that safety for the person can be really impactful.
Thank you for answering that. That was a question that was sent because sometimes before a DUI happens, that was like the origin of the question. So that
Mhm.
DUI will not happen, nor car accidents would not happen.
Yes, if the person feels supported, more likely than not, they will make less risky choices.
Can you define support?
Yes. So support can look super different for different folks, but generally it would look like non-judgmental, consistent, reliable communication. So if I have someone in my life, if I'm struggling and I have someone in my life that I know will check up on me, that I know will not judge me if I'm struggling with something, and that I know will be there if I were to reach out, that is what support really looks like and helps folks feel safe. Good
Okay.
question.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any questions from the audience? Do we have any remaining questions? How can you make someone open up about their issues if they are not the type to open up easily?
Not uncommon, and not uncommon, certainly when there's addictive behaviors or mental health needs, but I think a misperception is that we have to make things really explicit and ask, you're really struggling. Do you feel depressed? Or how can I help you? You're drinking a lot. And right. And so having someone open up, the best way is the foot in the door method, which is where you just ask small questions and eventually in the hopes that they will open up more and more, if that makes sense. So I might ask something like, hey, it seems like you had a really hard day if this is like in treatment or with a friend even, right? Like, hey, it seems like you're having a rough time. They might open up a little bit, and then I might ask more questions about what they're sharing and sort of just opens the door more and more. Question.
Callie, one question that I got also is what happens if it's a person is older than me, like my parent or my uncle or my grandfather? How do
Yes.
you convince, or how do I present myself so that I can be helpful to them?
Yes. I think the consistently non-judgmental but present uh process, right? Or vibe is really most effective. So I've worked with a lot of communities where it is a parent or an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent who are really struggling with, say alcohol or gambling, and it's a child who comes in and they're concerned, and them showing up consistently, maybe showing up physically more than they had in the past, if they're able to, or calling more consistently, just being available a little bit more reliably and consistently often is what is needed to have, get in the door with the parent or the elder and you start from there. It's a process, but
Okay. So I guess there are no more questions. I don't see any on the chat. So thank you so much, Callie. And then we will see you next week, February 5th, for the mental health needs of people with living with AIDS/HIV.
wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yes, and I will be posting the